The seeker stands before a paradox that has haunted Western esotericism since the Alexandrian Symposia. How does one transform the leaden weight of unconscious existence into the luminous gold of awakened consciousness? This is not mere metaphor. It is the central philosophical problem that unites the alchemical laboratories of medieval Europe, the analytical psychology of Carl Jung, and the initiatic schools that persist in guarding their secrets against the corrosive banality of modernity. The colors of awakening, specifically the Albedo and Rubedo phases of the Alchemical Opus, represent the culminating stages of this transformative work, yet they remain profoundly misunderstood by those who approach them with superficial enthusiasm rather than philosophical rigor. The historical pedigree of this teaching extends through a constellation of luminaries. Hermes Trismegistus, that syncretic fusion of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes, established the foundational axiom: as above, so below, as within, so without. Paracelsus, the revolutionary physician-magician of the Renaissance, understood that the alchemical vessel was ultimately the human soul itself. Maria Prophetess, the legendary Alexandrian alchemist, encoded in her cryptic axioms the psychological dynamics of integration. And Jung, heir to this tradition whether he acknowledged it fully or not, provided the interpretive framework through which modern consciousness could access these ancient operations. The premise that grounds the Hermetic School's approach must be stated with absolute clarity. The genuine secret is not external. No ritual performed without internal correspondence, no symbol contemplated without psychological penetration, no teaching received without rigorous self-examination will yield authentic transformation. The work is interior, psychological, and spiritual in the most demanding sense. It requires nothing less than the complete reconstruction of the psychic apparatus through which one experiences reality. The colors that emerge in this process are not decorative. They are diagnostic indices of profound structural changes in consciousness itself. This investigation proceeds from a position of informed skepticism. The alchemical tradition has been corrupted by New Age dilettantism, commercialized mysticism, and the presumption that transformation can be purchased or conferred rather than earned through ordeal. The Hermetic School rejects such degradation absolutely. What follows is an analysis suitable for those who approach the great work with the seriousness it demands, those willing to surrender comfortable illusions for the sake of authentic knowledge. The Alchemical Opus, in its classical formulation, proceeds through distinct chromatic phases that correspond to psychological and spiritual states. The complete sequence, Nigredo, blackening, Albedo, whitening, citrinitas, yellowing, and Rubedo, reddening, constitutes a map of consciousness transformation. While earlier phases involve decomposition and purification, the Albedo and Rubedo represent the constructive, integrative work that yields the philosopher's stone. Understanding their operation requires situating them within the broader alchemical worldview. The foundation rests upon the three philosophical principles articulated by Paracelsus: sulfur, the soul, the principle of combustibility and identity; mercury, the spirit, the principle of volatility and transformation; and salt, the body, the principle of fixity and materialization. These are not chemical substances in the modern sense, but rather ontological principles that interpenetrate all existence. The work of the later phases involves their harmonization, bringing the volatile and fixed, the spiritual and material, into dynamic equilibrium. The Albedo achieves a preliminary union. The Rubedo perfects and stabilizes it. This system connects profoundly with other Western esoteric traditions. The Kabbalistic tree of life provides a parallel structure. The descent into Malkuth, material consciousness, and the subsequent ascent through the Sephiroth toward Kheta, divine consciousness, mirrors the alchemical solvet coagula, dissolution and coagulation. The Neoplatonic doctrine of emanation and return, articulated by Plotinus and elaborated by Proclus, describes the same fundamental movement: the soul's descent into matter and its laborious return to the One, enriched by the experience of multiplicity yet transcending it. The Rosicrucian tradition, crystallized in texts like the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, presents the alchemical marriage as the central mystery, This is precisely what the transition from Albedo to Rubedo accomplishes, the coniunctio oppositorum, the wedding of opposites that generates the philosopher's stone. The bride and groom are not external entities but internal principles, the conscious ego and the unconscious depths, the masculine solar principle and the feminine lunar principle, the mortal and the divine aspects of the self. The mentality required of the authentic adept cannot be overstated. First, the magical will, not mere desire or wishful thinking, but the concentrated, purified intentionality that can direct psychic energy with precision. This will must be developed through rigorous practice and tested through ordeal. Second, the occult ethic, an understanding that knowledge brings responsibility, that power over the psyche must be wielded with integrity, that the work is never undertaken for ego inflation or trivial gain. Third, the disposition for doubt, the philosopher's willingness to question every assumption, test every hypothesis against experience, and reject comfortable certainties when they obstruct truth. The adept approaching the Albedo and Rubedo phases must have already endured the Nigredo, the descent into psychological dissolution, the confrontation with the shadow, the death of the naive ego. Without this foundation, the subsequent work becomes fantasy, dissociation, or spiritual inflation. The whitening and reddening are not escapes from the blackness, but its necessary continuation and transformation. Before examining the Albedo and Rubedo, one must understand what precedes them. The Nigredo represents the putrefactio, the decomposition of the prima materia, the raw, unconscious psyche. Psychologically, this is the phase where comfortable self-conceptions dissolve, where neurotic patterns reveal themselves as prisons, where the shadow, Jung's term for the disowned aspects of personality, emerges into consciousness with terrifying force. The alchemical texts describe this as blackness, rotting, death. The practitioner experiences depression, disorientation, the collapse of meaning structures. This is not pathology to be medicated away, but a necessary death. The ego must die to its limited identification with persona, with social conditioning, with the false self constructed through adaptation to external demands. Maria Prophetess warns, one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. The Nigredo is this initial dissolution into multiplicity, the disintegration of the false unity of the naive ego. Only when this dissolution has been endured, when the practitioner has descended into the unconscious depths and survived, when the shadow has been acknowledged and its energy reclaimed, can the whitening begin. The Albedo is not an escape, but a resurrection, and resurrection presupposes death. The Albedo, the whitening, marks the emergence from darkness into light. Alchemically, it is represented by the washing, ablutio, the separation of pure from impure, the distillation of essence from dross. The blackened matter of the Nigredo is subjected to repeated cleansings until it becomes white, the Albedo proper. This white substance, called the white stone or luna, represents the purified consciousness that has passed through dissolution and emerged cleansed. Psychologically, the Albedo corresponds to what Jung termed the integration of the shadow and the initial encounter with the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype. Having confronted the shadow in the Nigredo, the practitioner now begins to differentiate authentic self from false self. The ego, having died, is resurrected but transformed, no longer identified solely with conscious attitudes. It now acknowledges the unconscious as a legitimate source of wisdom and energy. The whitening is characterized by a sense of clarity, detachment, objectivity. The practitioner develops what the alchemists called the philosophical mercury, a fluid, reflective consciousness capable of perceiving without distortion. This is the lunar consciousness, receptive, reflective, discriminating. It is the development of the observing self that can witness the contents of consciousness without being overwhelmed by them. However, the albedo remains incomplete. It is associated with the moon, reflective rather than self-luminous, cool rather than warm, passive rather than active. The white stone possesses purity but lacks vitality. It is a necessary stage but insufficient. The practitioner who remains fixated at this level achieves detachment but risks becoming cold, isolated, overly intellectual. The heart remains uninvolved, the body remains unintegrated. The work must continue. The alchemical texts speak of the Albedo as a lesser work, opus minor, in contrast to the greater work, opus major, of the Rubedo. This distinction is crucial. The Albedo represents psychological purification and the initial integration of unconscious contents. It is preparatory. The Rubedo represents the full synthesis of opposites, the incarnation of spirit in matter, the achievement of the genuine philosopher's stone. Between Albedo and Rubedo lies a threshold, sometimes represented by the citrinitas, the yellowing, though many alchemical systems collapse this into the Rubedo itself. This is the phase where the purified consciousness of the Albedo must be animated, warmed, brought into dynamic relationship with itself. The philosophical texts speak of a marriage, the coniunctio, between king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. Psychologically, this is the integration of anima and animus with the ego, and more profoundly, the reconciliation of the self, Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, with the ego. The ego recognizes that it is not the master of the psyche, but its servant. The self, that transcendent center of wholeness, begins to manifest not as an external deity, but as the innermost core of one's own being. This transition is fraught with danger. The practitioner who has achieved the clarity and detachment of the Albedo may resist the passionate engagement required for the Rubedo. There is a temptation to remain in the cool silver light of the moon rather than risk the burning heat of the sun. Yet the texts are explicit. Without the reddening, the work remains incomplete. The stone remains white, pure but lifeless. The Rubedo, the reddening, is the completion of the great work. Alchemically, it is represented by the color red, the Rubedo proper, and by the achievement of the philosopher's stone itself, sometimes called the red stone or the elixir of life. This is the final stage where the purified substance of the Albedo is subjected to the red fire, ignis rubeus, the most intense heat, and transmuted into gold. The symbolism is precise. Gold represents not wealth in the economic sense, but perfection, incorruptibility, the stable and eternal. The philosopher's stone is the psyche fully integrated, capable of transmuting all experiences, joy and suffering, success and failure, pleasure and pain, into wisdom and compassion. It is the consciousness that has achieved what the Buddhists call equanimity, and what the Stoics called ataraxia, but with warmth and engagement rather than cold indifference. Psychologically, the Rubedo represents the full integration of the self. The ego, purified in the Albedo, now enters into living relationship with the self. This is not ego death in the sense of annihilation, but ego transformation. The personal self becomes transparent to the transpersonal self. Jung described this as the individuation process reaching its culmination. The ego recognizes itself as the expression of a larger wholeness, and the opposites within the psyche, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational order and chaos, are held in dynamic tension rather than splitting into conflict. The Rubedo is characterized by several qualities. First, passionate engagement with life. Unlike the cool detachment of the Albedo, the Rubedo brings warmth, love, vital energy. The practitioner does not withdraw from the world, but engages it fully, with the whole of their being. Second, creative power. The philosopher's stone is said to transmute base metals into gold. Psychologically, this is the ability to transform suffering into wisdom, to find meaning in chaos, to create beauty from ugliness. Third, ethical action. The integrated self acts from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from love rather than fear, from wisdom rather than ignorance. The alchemical marriage is consummated in the Rubedo. King and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury unite in the hermetic vessel of consciousness itself. This union generates the divine child, the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, which is simultaneously the goal of the work and the transformed practitioner themselves. The child represents the rebirth of the self at a higher level of integration, the new personality that embodies both the wisdom of experience and the innocence of pure being. The red stone, unlike the white stone, is active and generative. It possesses the power of multiplication. One grain can transmute infinite quantities of base metal. Psychologically, this means the integrated self radiates its influence naturally and spontaneously. The practitioner no longer needs to work on themselves constantly. They have become the work. Their presence transforms others not through manipulation or proselytizing, but through simple authenticity. Yet here emerges a crucial paradox that the authentic tradition insists upon. The work is never truly complete. The Rubedo is not a static achievement, but a dynamic state that must be maintained through continued vigilance and practice. The alchemists warn against the fixation, the presumption that one has achieved permanent enlightenment. The philosopher's stone itself must be multiplied through repeated application of the process. Each spiral through the phases occurs at a higher level of integration, revealing subtler levels of unconsciousness to be integrated, deeper shadows to be acknowledged, more profound unions to be achieved. This is why the authentic schools maintain secrecy and selectivity. The work is arduous, dangerous, and lifelong. It cannot be mass-marketed or simplified into weekend workshops. The Hermetic School exists precisely to preserve this rigor against the tide of spiritual consumerism that would reduce the great work to a commodified self-help technique. The transition from Albedo to Rubedo constitutes the most demanding ordeal in the entire alchemical process. Having achieved the purification and clarity of the white stone, the practitioner faces a choice: remain in the safety of detached observation or risk everything in the passionate engagement required for the final synthesis. This is the crisis that separates the dilettante from the adept, the theorist from the practitioner, the scholar from the sage. The alchemical texts encode this crisis in the symbol of the red fire that must be applied to the white matter. This fire is not gentle. It is the fire of existential commitment, of passionate engagement with one's own depths, of willingness to surrender even the hard-won purity of the albedo if that purity has become another form of defense against authentic life. The practitioner who has achieved detachment through the albedo may have unconsciously used that detachment as a refuge from feeling, from vulnerability, from the risk of being fully human. Psychologically, this crisis manifests as a confrontation with what Jung called the mana personality, the inflation that comes from touching archetypal energies. The practitioner who has integrated the shadow and achieved clarity may begin to identify with this achievement, to construct a new, more sophisticated form of ego around their spiritual accomplishments. They may develop a sense of superiority, of being more conscious than others, of having transcended ordinary human limitations. This inflation is perhaps the most dangerous obstacle on the path precisely because it disguises itself as advancement. The Rubedo demands the sacrifice of this inflation. The practitioner must recognize that the clarity and purity they have achieved are not possessions but gifts, not accomplishments but graces. The ego that claims ownership of the work must die again, not the brutal death of the Nigredo, but the more subtle death of surrender to something greater than itself. This is what the mystical traditions call kenosis, self-emptying, the creation of space within oneself for the divine to enter. The philosophical distinction between this esoteric crisis and modern psychological pathology must be precisely articulated. Contemporary psychology, operating within a materialist framework, views psychological crisis as dysfunction to be eliminated. Anxiety, depression, disorientation, these are symptoms to be medicated, managed, resolved as quickly as possible. The esoteric tradition, by contrast, recognizes that certain forms of psychological crisis are teleological. They serve a purpose in the unfolding of consciousness toward greater wholeness. The crisis at the threshold of the Rubedo is not pathological, but purposeful. It is the psyche's demand for integration at a deeper level. The suffering involved is not meaningless, but meaningful. It is the birth pang of the new self struggling to emerge. The disorientation is not a bug, but a feature. It represents the dissolution of the old ego structure to make space for a larger, more inclusive identity. However, this distinction requires discernment. Not all psychological crisis is initiatic. Genuine mental illness exists and requires clinical intervention. The esoteric schools have always recognized the difference between the divine madness of the initiatic process and the pathological madness of genuine disorder. The former is temporary, purposeful, and leads to greater integration. The latter is chronic, destructive, and leads to disintegration. The crisis between Albedo and Rubedo tests the practitioner's capacity for holding paradox. They must simultaneously maintain the clarity achieved in the Albedo while opening to the passion and engagement required for the Rubedo. They must be both detached and involved, both observing and participating, both empty and full. This paradox cannot be resolved intellectually. It must be lived, embodied, incarnated in daily existence. The dark night of the soul, as described by St. John of the Cross, provides a parallel in the Christian mystical tradition. This is not the active purgation of the Nigredo, but a passive ordeal where the soul experiences abandonment by God, the withdrawal of all consolation, all sense of meaning, all feeling of progress. The mystic must continue in faith without any confirmation, must persist in the work without any sign of advancement. This is precisely the ordeal of the transition to Rubedo. The practitioner must continue when all external supports have been removed, when even the clarity of the albedo seems to have departed. The teleological necessity of this suffering deserves emphasis. The great work is not a technique for avoiding suffering, but a method for transforming it. The practitioner who enters the work hoping to escape pain will be disappointed. Rather, the work offers the possibility of suffering consciously, purposefully, in service to growth, rather than in meaningless repetition of neurotic patterns. The suffering becomes sacred not because pain is good in itself, but because it becomes the raw material for transformation. This crisis reveals who possesses the genuine magical will and who merely harbors spiritual ambition. Will is tested in the fire. Those who lack true commitment will retreat to the safety of the albedo, or worse, will fall backward into the nigredo, losing even the progress they had made. Those who possess will press forward through the crisis, not with grim determination, but with trust in the process, with surrender to the wisdom of the self that knows what is required, even when the ego does not. The practitioner who survives the crisis and completes the Rubedo emerges transformed. The philosopher's stone, the integrated self, the gold of consciousness, is not an object possessed, but a state embodied. This is not a mystical abstraction, but a concrete transformation with observable characteristics and practical implications. The state of consciousness achieved through the Rubedo can be described through several interrelated qualities. First, wholeness. The practitioner experiences themselves as complete, not perfect in the sense of flawless, but whole in the sense of inclusive. The opposites within the psyche are no longer warring factions, but complementary aspects of a unified field of awareness. Shadow and persona, anima and animus, conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, all are recognized as necessary parts of the totality of being. Second, spontaneity. Having integrated the unconscious, the practitioner no longer needs to struggle against themselves. Action flows naturally from wholeness, rather than being forced through willpower against internal resistance. This is the wu-wei of Taoism, effortless action, not because no effort is required, but because the action aligns with the deeper currents of the self, rather than opposing them. Third, creative engagement. The philosopher's stone is generative. The integrated practitioner becomes a source of newness in the world, not through grandiose projects or egoic ambition, but through the simple fact of their authentic presence. They create because they cannot help but create. Creation is the natural expression of wholeness engaging with life. Fourth, ethical clarity. This is perhaps the most significant transformation. The integrated self acts ethically not from obedience to external rules, but from internal necessity. Right action emerges spontaneously from wholeness. The practitioner does not need to consult moral codes because they have become themselves a moral compass. This is not license for egoic indulgence, but rather the achievement of what Kant called autonomy, the capacity for self-legislation according to universal principles that one recognizes within oneself. The practical applications for the modern individual are profound yet subtle. The Hermetic tradition does not promise worldly power or material success in the conventional sense. Rather, it offers something both more modest and more radical: the capacity to live authentically, to respond to life's challenges with wisdom and compassion, to find meaning in existence not through external validation, but through internal coherence. The transformed practitioner relates to the world differently. They are in the world but not of it, engaged fully with life's demands, yet not identified with temporary circumstances. They experience pleasure and pain, success and failure, praise and blame with equanimity, not because they don't care, but because they recognize these as the play of phenomena arising within the vast space of consciousness itself. Yet with this transformation comes responsibility. The alchemical tradition insists that the work is never undertaken for purely personal benefit. The philosopher's stone, once achieved, must be used in service to the wider whole. Jung expressed this through his concept of individuation as both a personal and a collective process. The individual who becomes whole contributes to the healing of the collective unconscious. The esoteric schools encode this in the principle of service. The adept is obligated to assist others on the path to preserve and transmit the teaching, to embody in their life the principles they have realized. This is where the rigor and discipline of the Hermetic School become essential. The teaching cannot be democratized without being degraded. The work requires qualified guidance, authentic lineage, tested methods. The modern presumption that all spiritual paths are equally valid, that anyone can be their own guru, that ancient wisdom can be casually integrated with New Age eclecticism. These attitudes represent precisely the dissolution of the tradition that genuine schools must resist. The Hermetic School exists to maintain standards. Not everyone is ready for the work. Not everyone possesses the will required. Not everyone can endure the ordeal. This is not elitism, but reality. The alchemical texts themselves are written in obscure symbolism, precisely to exclude the unqualified. The authentic schools maintain selective admission, not from arrogance, but from recognition that premature exposure to these teachings can be psychologically destabilizing for those unprepared. The integrated practitioner becomes a living embodiment of the teaching. They do not proselytize or seek followers. Their life itself becomes a demonstration of the possibilities inherent in human consciousness. They prove through their existence that transformation is possible, that the goal of awakened awareness can be achieved, that the suffering of the human condition can be transmuted into wisdom and compassion. This is the legacy of the Great Work, a lineage of transformed individuals who preserve and transmit the teaching not through books alone, but through the alchemy of direct transmission. Consciousness touching consciousness, awakening itself in another. The colors of awakening, the white of purified clarity and the red of passionate engagement, are not mere stages in a process, but states of being that must be embodied, lived, demonstrated. The seeker who approaches these teachings must understand: the gold you seek exists nowhere but in the crucible of your own consciousness. The laboratory is your life. The prima materia is your own raw, unconscious psyche. The fire that transforms is the heat of your authentic engagement with existence. The philosopher's stone is not a thing to be found, but a state to be achieved. The integration of all that you are into a coherent, creative, compassionate whole. The Albedo and Rubedo are not mystical abstractions, but precise descriptions of psychological processes that can be verified in experience by those who undertake the work with sufficient rigor and commitment. They represent the completion of a journey that begins in the darkness of unconscious existence and culminates in the luminous awareness of integrated selfhood. The Hermetic School stands as guardian of this teaching against the corruptions of a culture that seeks easy answers, quick fixes, and comfortable illusions. The way requires everything. It offers no consolation prizes, no partial achievements, no shortcuts. It demands the sacrifice of everything you think you are for the sake of discovering what you truly are. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the fire, and that will is forged only through ordeal, tested only through crisis, and proven only through transformation.